I remember the weight of the first coin I ever held. My father pressed it into my palm when I was 7 years old, a worn brass token stamped with the Aquila on one side and a shipping guild's mark on the other. He closed my fingers around it and told me that everything in the Imperium could be bought or sold if you knew the right price, and that knowing the right price was what separated men like us from the billions who merely existed in the Emperor's sight. I believed him then, with the absolute faith a child has in his father's wisdom. I believe him still, even now, even after everything, though I understand now that he never told me what the price would be for believing it. We were charter merchants on a mid-tier trade route between 3 hive worlds in the Segmentum Obscurus, a designation that meant we had the legal right to transport goods across those specific worlds and nowhere else, a limitation enforced by contracts written in High Gothic on parchment that was older than my grandfather. My family had held that charter for 6 generations, paying the tithes and fees that kept it valid, navigating the labyrinthine requirements of the administratum with the kind of patient precision that was bred into us like eye color or blood type. My father taught me the trade routes first, then the ledgers, then the art of negotiation, and finally, the most important lesson. Everyone wants something, and if you can determine what that something is before they realize you're looking for it, you will never starve in the Emperor's domain. The ship I inherited when my father died was called the Times Prophet's Blessing *, a name he had chosen with characteristic practicality. It was a medium-haul cargo vessel, 150 meters of riveted steel and prayer-anointed engines, blessed by a tech priest who charged us 3% of our annual gross revenue for the privilege of his incense and incantations. The ship's machine spirit was temperamental but reliable, prone to unexplained vibrations in the aft cargo hold, and a tendency to require additional promethium during void transitions, inefficiencies I learned to account for in my calculations. The crew was small, 18 souls, including myself, a navigator from a minor house whose bloodline was just thin enough to make them affordable, an engineer who maintained our systems with the jealous devotion of a man tending a garden, and 16 others who handled loading, basic maintenance, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a vessel operational between the stars. My first solo voyage was a simple run, the kind my father had made hundreds of times. Agricultural supplements from the hive world Carsen to the forge world Moloch 7, manufactured goods on the return trip. The supplements were vast quantities of processed corpse starch, protein reclaimed from Carsen's dead and rendered into edible bricks that the forge world's workers consumed between shifts. I remember standing in the cargo hold during loading, watching servitors with dead eyes and whirring augmetics stack the crates with mechanical precision, and feeling a small twist of something in my stomach that I deliberately did not examine. The Emperor provides, I told myself. The dead serve in death as they served in life. This was holy work. This movement of resources from where they were plentiful to where they were needed. The margins on that voyage were acceptable. A 7% profit after all, tithes, fees, bribes, and operational costs. I paid the necessary officials at both ends, men and women who sat in offices that smelled of old paper and stale incense, who stamped my documents without looking at my face, who extended their hands for small leather purses that I had prepared in advance. It was the rhythm of commerce, ancient and unchanging, a dance performed in offices and docking bays across the Imperium. I learned to recognize the signs of who wanted what. The administratum clerk who lingered over the origin certificates wanted a percentage of the cargo. The docking master who complained about berth assignments wanted a flat fee. The customs inspector who mentioned his daughter's upcoming birthday wanted something that could be converted to personal use. Always something. Always a price. The years began to accumulate, marked in voyage logs and profit margins. I married a woman from another merchant family, a merger of interests that benefited both our charters. And we had 2 children who I began training in the trade as soon as they could read a manifest. My son learned quickly, developing a head for numbers that exceeded my own. My daughter had the gift for reading people, for seeing the need behind the neutral faces of officials and clients. I was proud of them in the way merchants measure pride. They were profitable, they were competent, they would continue the family trade. I did not think about whether they were happy, because happiness was not a commodity that appeared in my ledgers. The first irregularity I noticed was so small that I almost dismissed it. A shipment of mining equipment bound for an ore world came with documentation that listed the equipment's blessed status, confirmed by a tech priest whose seal I recognized from previous transactions. But when I inspected the crates during loading, I saw that the ritual marks on the equipment were wrong, applied with paint rather than cut into the metal as the proper rites demanded. I stood in the cargo hold with the manifest in my hand and felt that same twist in my stomach I had felt years ago, standing among the corpse starch. The equipment would function regardless of whether the blessings were authentic. The ore world would receive what it had paid for, in practical terms. But the falsification of sacred rites was heresy, and heresy was the one thing that could not be bought or sold, the one price that could not be negotiated. I went to the shipping agent who had brokered the transaction, a man named Vec, who I had dealt with dozens of times, who had always been reliable, who had attended the same trade guild meetings as my father. I found him in his office, a cramped space on Carsen's third commercial level, surrounded by cogitator banks and filing cabinets that reached to the ceiling. When I asked him about the discrepancy, he did not meet my eyes. He shuffled papers on his desk and told me that certain arrangements had been made to expedite processing times, that the tech priests were overwhelmed with requests, that alternative blessing providers had been authorized by parties whose names he could not disclose. I asked him directly if the rites were false. He looked at me then, and I saw something in his face that I had never seen before: pity. "Everything can be bought or sold," he said, repeating my father's lesson back to me. "Even faith. Especially faith." The demand for blessed equipment exceeded the supply of genuine blessings, and where demand exceeded supply, a market emerged. The tech priests on a dozen forge worlds had been quietly supplementing their income by selling their seals to forgers, who applied them to equipment that had never been near a proper ritual. The practice had been running for years, maybe decades, spreading through the merchant networks like rust through steel. Everyone knew, everyone participated, everyone profited, and if I wanted to remain competitive, if I wanted to keep my charter, if I wanted to feed my family, I would participate too. I left his office and walked through the commercial levels for hours, moving past shops and offices and loading bays, watching the endless flow of commerce that was the lifeblood of the hive. I saw merchants arguing over prices, servitors hauling cargo, guild officials inspecting manifests, menials hauling themselves through another shift. The Emperor's domain, functioning exactly as it always had, sustained by 10,000 compromises that no one ever spoke of out loud. I thought about refusing. I thought about reporting what I had learned to the proper authorities. I thought about maintaining my integrity, about keeping my soul clean before the Emperor's judgment. And then I thought about my charter being revoked, about my family starving, about my children sold into servitude to pay my debts. I thought about all the other merchants who had surely faced this same choice and had chosen the practical path, the path that allowed them to continue operating, to continue eating, to continue existing. The next shipment, I accepted the falsified blessings without comment. It was a small thing at first, just mining equipment, then agricultural machinery, then weapon maintenance tools. The rites were false, but the equipment worked, and the worlds that received it never complained because they did not know, or because they did, and like me, they had chosen the practical path. I told myself that I was not truly complicit, that I was merely an intermediary in a system that was larger than myself, that refusing to participate would change nothing except my own circumstances. These were the prayers I said to myself at night, lying beside my wife, in our small quarters aboard the Times, Prophet's blessing asterisk, listening to the ship's machine spirit humming through the bulkheads, feeling the weight of my choices, pressing down on my chest like a physical burden. The margins improved. Without the expense of genuine blessings, the profit on each voyage increased by 3 to 4%. I reinvested the surplus into better quarters for the crew, into maintenance that kept the ship running more smoothly, into small luxuries that made life between the stars more bearable. I told myself I was using the profit well, that I was being a good captain, a good employer, a good father. I did not think about where that profit originated. did not trace the line back to the source, did not acknowledge that I was building my family's future on a foundation of heresy that I had once believed was the one thing that could not be compromised. The second irregularity was not small. A shipping agent I had never met before approached me on Moloch 7 with an opportunity that he described as extremely lucrative. He was a thin man with augmetic eyes that clicked and whirred when he looked at me, and he spoke in the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had delivered the same speech many times before. He had a client, he said, who needed to move certain cargo between systems without the usual documentation, without the usual inspections, without the usual trail of manifests and customs stamps that followed every legal shipment through the Imperium. The cargo was not illegal in itself, he assured me, but the client had reasons for preferring discretion, reasons that I would be compensated generously for not questioning. I asked what the cargo was. He told me it was Medicae supplies, intended for a frontier world that had been slow in paying its tithes, and had therefore been denied access to standard imperial supply chains. The cargo would save lives, he said. It was humanitarian work, in a sense, and the payment he offered was more than I would make in 3 standard voyages combined. I should have refused. I should have recognized that any deal requiring that much secrecy was not a deal that would end well for the parties involved. But I thought about my daughter's upcoming marriage, about the dowry I had promised, about the ship repairs I had been postponing, about the 1,000 costs that accumulated in a merchant's life like dust in corners. I thought about the falsified blessings I was already carrying, about the line I had already crossed, about how the distance between my current position and this new proposal was not actually as far as I wanted to believe. I told him I would do it. The cargo came aboard under the cover of routine loading operations, mixed in with legitimate goods so that the crates would pass casual inspection. I made sure I did not personally observe the loading, did not see what the crates contained, maintained a deliberate ignorance that I told myself would protect me if questions were ever asked. The voyage itself was uneventful. We made the jump to the frontier world, a desolate rock called Heth 7 that orbited a dying star, and transferred the cargo to local representatives who did not speak, who moved with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested military training, who paid me in unmarked credit chits that I immediately transferred to multiple accounts to avoid detection. When I returned to Carsen, I went to the temple district and made an offering at the shrine of the Emperor's divine commerce, a small cathedral where merchants had prayed for profitable voyages for centuries. I knelt before the golden aquila and tried to feel something, tried to connect with the faith that had been part of my childhood, that my father had taught me was as essential as knowing the trade routes. But I felt nothing except the cold stone beneath my knees and the smell of incense that seemed suddenly false, like the blessings on the mining equipment, like everything else in the Imperium that claimed to be holy but was actually just another transaction waiting to happen. The shipping agent contacted me again 6 months later with another opportunity, and then another, and then they stopped being occasional occurrences and became a regular part of my business operations. I learned not to ask questions about the cargo, learned to recognize the signs of shipments that existed outside the official records, learned to calculate the additional risk into my pricing. Some of the shipments were probably what I was told they were. Others, I began to suspect, were something else entirely. I saw crates that hummed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I saw containers marked with symbols that were not in any imperial registry I recognized. I saw cargo that my crew refused to go near, that they would only load using servitors, that left a smell in the hold that lasted for weeks after delivery. The money continued to accumulate. I upgraded the Times Profits blessing times with better engines, better shields, better everything. I purchased a second ship and hired a captain to run it, expanding my operations into a small fleet. My son began managing the legitimate trade routes, while I personally handled the sensitive shipments, a division of labor that allowed me to maintain the fiction that I was protecting him from the worst of it. My daughter married into a profitable family, a union that opened new trade opportunities and brought fresh capital into our operations. By any objective measure, I was successful. My charter was secure, my family was prosperous, my reputation in the merchant guild was solid. I was 43 years old when I first transported weapons to an insurgent group on a contested world. The shipping agent did not tell me explicitly what the cargo was, But I knew. I had been doing this long enough to recognize the weight distribution of weapon crates, the kind of shielding used to mask their contents from certain types of scanners, the specific routes that avoided Imperial Navy patrol patterns. I stood in the cargo hold looking at those crates and understood that I had crossed a line that I could never uncross, that everything before this had been compromises but this was treason, that I was now complicit in deaths that would occur when those weapons were used against the Emperor's servants. I delivered them anyway. I collected my payment. I returned home. The nightmares started shortly after. I would dream that I was back in the cargo hold, surrounded by crates that leaked blood instead of oil, that whispered instead of hummed, that bore my name instead of shipping codes. I would wake in the middle of the ship's night cycle, drenched in sweat, listening to the ambient sounds of the vessel and trying to convince myself that I had no choice, that refusing the shipment would have meant losing everything, that I was trapped in a system that gave me no real options except to continue forward or to fall. My wife asked if I was ill. I told her it was stress, that the business was growing faster than I could manage, that I needed to hire additional staff. All of this was true, in a sense. I did not tell her about the weapons, about the insurgents, about the growing certainty that I was damned in ways that no amount of prayer or penance could remedy. The third irregularity was not an irregularity at all, but a dawning realization that the entire system I operated within was corrupt from top to bottom, that every level of imperial commerce involved compromises and falsifications and quiet heresies that everyone acknowledged privately while maintaining a facade of righteousness publicly. I began to notice the signs everywhere. The officials who demanded bribes were not outliers but the standard. The forged documents were not exceptions but routine. The illegal shipments were not rare occurrences, but a fundamental component of how goods actually moved through the Imperium, necessary because the official channels were so clogged with bureaucracy and inefficiency that nothing would function if everyone followed the rules. I attended a merchant guild meeting where the discussion turned to new imperial regulations on cargo inspections, and I watched men and women who I had known for years discuss strategies for circumventing those regulations with the casual expertise of professionals solving a technical problem. No one expressed concern about the moral implications. No one suggested that perhaps we should follow the regulations. The conversation was purely practical: which inspectors could be bribed, which documentation could be forged, which routes avoided the most stringent oversight. I sat there listening and realized that I was not an outlier, not a fallen merchant who had strayed from the path. I was exactly where the system wanted me to be, doing exactly what it required to function. My father had taught me that everything could be bought or sold if you knew the right price. What he had not taught me, what perhaps he had not known himself or had chosen not to articulate, was that the price was not always measured in currency. Sometimes the price was your integrity, sometimes it was your faith, sometimes it was your soul, sold off piece by piece in transactions so small that you did not realize you were doing it until you reached for that soul one day and discovered it was no longer there. I was 47 when the Inquisition came for me. Not for me specifically, not at first. They were investigating a cult on Moloch 7, heretics who had been corrupting tech priests and diverting military supplies to enemies of the Imperium. The investigation eventually led them to the shipping networks that had transported those supplies, and those networks led them to merchants like myself who had asked too few questions and accepted too much money. I was arrested on Carsen while overseeing a cargo transfer taken from the docking bay by Arbites in full armor who did not explain the charges, who did not allow me to contact my family, who transported me to a detention facility in the Underhive where the air smelled like rust and human waste. The interrogation room was a small cube of reinforced rockcrete, lit by a single flickering luminator that cast shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The Inquisitor was a woman with a face like carved marble and eyes that looked at me as if I were already dead, and she was merely conducting an autopsy to determine the cause. She did not threaten me. She did not need to. She simply placed my shipping records on the table between us, records that I had thought were secure, that I had paid good money to keep hidden, and she asked me to explain them. I tried to maintain the fiction at first. I claimed ignorance, said I had been deceived by my shipping agents, portrayed myself as a victim of a system I did not fully understand. She listened without expression, letting me speak until I ran out of words, and then she told me that they had already interrogated the shipping agents, that they had already seized my ships, that they had already arrested my son, who had been running parallel operations on the legitimate side of the business. She told me that the only question that remained was whether I would cooperate fully and accept the mercy of a quick death, or whether I would resist and be handed over to the tech priests for conversion into a servitor. My brain wiped clean of everything except the ability to perform basic labor. My body augmented with machinery until I was more machine than man, sentenced to centuries of mindless service as punishment for my crimes. I cooperated. I told them everything. The falsified blessings, the undocumented shipments, the weapons, the insurgents, the entire network of compromises and heresies that I had participated in for more than 2 decades. I named names, provided routes, handed over access codes to accounts I had thought were secure. I did this not because I hoped for leniency, but because I was tired, because the weight of carrying all those secrets had become unbearable, because there was a kind of relief in finally speaking the truth out loud, even though I knew the truth would not save me. The Inquisitor listened to my confession for 11 hours. When I was finished, when I had nothing left to tell, she stood and looked down at me with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. I could not distinguish which. She told me that my cooperation had earned me the right to a quick death rather than conversion, a mercy that I should be grateful for given the magnitude of my crimes. She told me that my family would be investigated, but would likely be spared if they could prove ignorance of my activities. She told me that my ships would be seized and repurposed for legitimate imperial commerce. And then she told me something that I have thought about every day since, every hour, every moment in this cell waiting for the execution that is now only days away. She told me that I was not special. She told me that the Inquisition conducted investigations like this constantly, across hundreds of worlds, uncovering networks of corruption that spread through the merchant class like disease through a body. She told me that they would never eliminate it entirely, because the Imperium was too vast, too complex, too dependent on unofficial channels and quiet compromises to function. She told me that merchants like me were inevitable, that the system created us as surely as it created servitors, that we were products of the same grinding machinery that had been operating for 10,000 years, since the Emperor's ascension, maybe since humanity first reached for the stars. She told me that my only mistake was being unlucky enough to transport supplies for a cult that the Inquisition had chosen to investigate, that thousands of other merchants were conducting similar operations at this very moment and would never be caught, that my fate was not a reflection of justice but of probability. I am writing this in my cell because the Arbites allow condemned prisoners to make a final statement, a tradition that serves no purpose except to give the dying something to occupy their final hours. I do not expect this document to be read by anyone who matters. I do not expect it to change anything. I write it because I need to articulate something that I have been struggling to understand since my arrest, since my interrogation, since that moment in the cargo hold when I first saw the weapon crates and chose to look away. My father taught me that everything in the Imperium could be bought or sold if you knew the right price. He was correct, but what he did not tell me, what I had to learn through my own damnation, was that sometimes knowing the right price is itself a kind of heresy, because it means you have calculated the value of things that should not be valued, that you have placed them on scales that should not weigh them, that you have treated the sacred as if it were merely another commodity in a transaction. I think about the corpse starch I transported on my first voyage, the dead rendered into bricks and shipped between worlds like any other cargo. I think about how I felt that small twist in my stomach and chose not to examine it, chose to accept the Emperor's promise that the dead serve in death as they served in life. But who decided that their service should take that form? Who calculated that the most efficient use of human remains was to feed them to other humans? Who made the transaction that transformed death from a sacred passage into a logistical problem with a profitable solution? I think about the falsified blessings, about the tech priests who sold their seals to forgers, about the machinery that functioned perfectly well regardless of whether it had been properly consecrated. If the machines worked without the blessings, were the blessings ever necessary? And if they were not necessary, were they ever sacred? Or were they always just another transaction, another fee extracted from merchants like myself, another item on a ledger sheet in the vast accounting of imperial commerce? I think about the weapons I transported, about the people who died when those weapons were used. I tell myself that I did not pull the triggers, that I was merely an intermediary, that refusing to transport them would have changed nothing except my own fate. But I know this is a lie I tell to make the weight bearable. I am responsible. I chose to accept the contract. I chose to load the cargo. I chose, in that moment, and in 1,000 moments before it, to prioritize my survival over the lives of people I would never meet, whose names I would never know, who died, because I decided that my family's prosperity was worth more than their existence. The Inquisitor told me that I was a product of the system, inevitable and unremarkable. I think she meant this as a statement of fact, a simple observation about the mechanics of imperial commerce, but I hear it as something else, as an accusation that is somehow worse than if she had called me a heretic or a traitor. To be a heretic implies choice, implies that you have selected damnation from among alternatives. To be a product of the system implies that you never had a choice at all, that you were always going to end up here, in this cell, writing this confession, waiting for an execution that is merely the final transaction in a lifetime of transactions. I do not know if I believe that. I do not know if I can accept that my damnation was predetermined, that the moment my father pressed that first coin into my palm and taught me to calculate the price of things, my fate was sealed. I want to believe that I had choices, that there were moments when I could have chosen differently, that I bear genuine responsibility for the path I took, rather than being a passive victim of systemic forces beyond my control. Because if I am merely a product of the system, if I am as inevitable and unremarkable as the Inquisitor claimed, then what does that say about the Imperium itself? What does it say about an empire that creates merchants like me, as surely as it creates servitors, that depends on our corruption to function, that punishes us when we are caught, but relies on thousands more like us to continue the same work? These are heretical thoughts. I know this. I am committing heresy even now, in my final hours, by questioning the divine order of the Imperium that the Emperor established. But I have already been condemned, already been judged, already been found wanting. There is no redemption available to me, no penance that can wash away decades of accumulated sin. All I have left is the truth, however uncomfortable, however blasphemous it may be. The truth is that I am a merchant in the Imperium of man, and being a merchant in the Imperium of man means being a heretic, not because merchants choose to be heretics, not because we reject the Emperor's light or worship the ruinous powers, but because the system itself is heretical, because it transforms everything sacred into something profane, because it measures the immeasurable and prices the priceless, and treats human souls as items on a cargo manifest. You cannot participate in imperial commerce without participating in that transformation. You cannot calculate profit margins without calculating the value of lives. You cannot optimize efficiency without treating people as resources to be managed rather than souls to be cherished. My father told me that everything could be bought or sold if you knew the right price. The Imperium is built on that principle. 10,000 years of transactions stacked on transactions, compromises layered on compromises, small heresies accumulated into a vast structure of systematic blasphemy that calls itself holy because it serves the Emperor's domain. But what if the Emperor never intended for his domain to function this way? What if the Imperium we have created is itself the greatest heresy, a corruption of his vision so complete that we can no longer recognize it as corruption? I will never know the answer to that question. The Arbites will come for me soon, perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow. They will take me to a courtyard where I will kneel before a commissioned officer who will speak the formal words of execution. I will be given the opportunity to repent, to speak the Emperor's name, to die with the appearance of faith, even if I no longer feel its substance. I will take that opportunity because I am a practical man, because I have spent my entire life making compromises, because there is no reason to stop now when one final compromise might make my death slightly easier to bear. But in this moment, in this cell, writing these words by the light of a flickering luminator that casts shadows that seem to move independently, I will allow myself to speak the truth without compromise. The truth is that I do not know if the Emperor would forgive me. The truth is that I do not know if the Emperor exists in any meaningful sense, or if he is merely another transaction, another value assigned by an Imperium that cannot conceive of anything that does not have a price. The truth is that I participated in a system that treated human beings as commodities, and that I knew it was wrong, and that I did it anyway because the alternative was to lose everything I had spent my life building. The truth is that I am a merchant in Warhammer 40K, and what happens when you are a merchant in Warhammer 40K is that you sell your soul in transactions so small that you do not notice you are doing it until the selling is done, and you are left holding a ledger full of prices, but no value, profits, but no profit, success, but no meaning. You build a life on top of corpses and call it prosperity. You transport weapons that kill innocents and call it logistics. You falsify sacred rites and call it efficiency. You do all of this in the Emperor's name, under the Emperor's sight, believing that the Emperor will understand, that the Emperor will forgive, that the Emperor will recognize that you had no choice, that you were doing what you had to do, to survive in a galaxy that offers no mercy to those who cannot pay the price of existence. And then, if you are unlucky enough to be noticed, if you are unfortunate enough to become the subject of an investigation, if you are simply the merchant whose name comes up when the Inquisition needs to demonstrate that someone, somewhere, is being held accountable for the corruption that everyone knows permeates every level of imperial society, then what happens is this: you are arrested, interrogated, condemned, and executed. Your family is investigated and probably survives because the Imperium needs merchants, needs people who will continue to participate in the system, needs the corruption to continue even as it occasionally purges those who become too visible, too successful, too unlucky. Your ships are seized and given to other merchants who will make the same compromises you made, who will transport the same cargo, who will pay the same bribes, who will participate in the same heresies until they too are eventually caught, or until they die of old age, having successfully navigated a lifetime of small treasons. The system continues. The Imperium functions. The transactions proceed. And somewhere, in a cell like this one, another merchant writes a confession that no one will read, trying to understand how they ended up here, trying to make sense of a life spent measuring the immeasurable, trying to calculate whether their existence had any meaning beyond the profit margins recorded in ledgers that will be seized and burned when the Arbites come to collect them. I hear footsteps in the corridor. Heavy boots on stone, the distinctive sound of Arbites moving with purpose. They are coming for me now. My time of writing is finished, my confession complete. I set down this pen and prepare to face whatever comes next, the courtyard and the officer, and the formal words, and the opportunity to repent. I will take that opportunity. I will speak the Emperor's name. I will die as I lived, making one final compromise, calculating one final price, choosing practicality over truth, because that is what merchants do. That is what the system created me to do. That is all I have ever known. But let this document stand, hidden somewhere in the vast archives of the Inquisition or destroyed immediately after my execution, as testimony to what happens when you are a merchant in Warhammer 40K. You measure the immeasurable. You price the priceless. You treat the sacred as profane. You participate in systematic heresy while calling it holy work. You sell your soul in transactions so small that you do not notice until the selling is done, and you are left with nothing except the certainty that you are damned, that you have always been damned, that the moment you accepted your father's coin and learned to calculate the price of things, you sealed your fate as surely as if you had signed a contract with the ruinous powers themselves. The footsteps stop outside my cell. The lock disengages with a mechanical click that sounds like the closing of a ledger. I stand and face the door, shoulders straight, a merchant to the end, ready to pay the final price that the Imperium has determined I owe. The door opens. The light from the corridor is blinding after the dimness of my cell. I cannot see the faces of the Arbites who have come to collect me, but I do not need to. I know what they are here for. I know what comes next. Everything in the Imperium can be bought or sold if you know the right price. My father taught me that, and he was right. What he did not teach me, what I learned too late, is that some prices cannot be paid, that some transactions cannot be completed, that there are debts that accumulate beyond any possibility of settlement. I owe such debts now, debts measured in lives and souls and sacred truths corrupted beyond recognition. I will pay what I can with my death, with my cooperation, with this confession, but I know it is not enough. It will never be enough. The Imperium will continue, the system will function, other merchants will make the same choices I made, and the vast machinery of commerce will grind forward, transforming everything it touches into transactions, reducing the infinite complexity of human existence to entries in a ledger that no one will ever fully balance. The Arbite's motion for me to follow. I step out of my cell and into the corridor, moving toward the courtyard and the execution that awaits me there. As I walk, I think one final time about that first coin my father gave me, about the weight of it in my palm, about his certainty that knowing the right price was what separated us from the billions who merely existed in the Emperor's sight. I wish I could go back to that moment. I wish I could press that coin back into his hand and tell him that some things should not have prices, that some truths should not be calculated, that the cost of measuring everything is the loss of the ability to value anything. But I cannot go back. I can only go forward, toward the courtyard, toward the officer who waits with his weapon and his formal words, toward the end that the Imperium has decreed for me. I go forward as a merchant, calculating even now, even in these final moments, wondering what my death will mean, what price it will pay, what transaction it will complete in the vast and incomprehensible accounting of the Emperor's domain. The answer, I think, is nothing. My death will mean nothing. It will pay no price. It will complete no transaction. It will be merely another entry in an endless ledger, remarkable only in its perfect unremarkability, inevitable as the Inquisitor said, a product of the system functioning exactly as it was designed to function. And perhaps that is the final truth, the one I have been circling around throughout this entire confession, that in the Imperium of man, nothing means anything except what it can be traded for. And when you can no longer be traded, when your value has been extracted and your usefulness exhausted, you simply cease to exist, forgotten as completely as if you had never been born. We reach the courtyard. I see the sky above, grey and infinite, and I think about all the worlds I have visited, all the transactions I have completed, all the prices I have paid and charged throughout a lifetime of commerce. And I think about the one price I never calculated, the one transaction I never recorded, the one debt I never acknowledged until it was too late to do anything except accept it, the price of my soul, sold so gradually, in such small increments, that I did not realize the selling was happening until the sale was complete, and I was standing here, in this courtyard, with nothing left to trade and nowhere left to run. The officer begins to speak the formal words. I prepare to speak the Emperor's name. The machinery of imperial justice moves forward, efficient and impersonal, a system optimized over 10,000 years to process heretics, with the same efficiency it processes cargo, lives with the same indifference it processes commodities. This is what happens when you are a merchant in Warhammer 40K. This is the price. This is the transaction. This is the ledger finally balanced, the account finally closed, the soul finally sold to the only buyer who always collects his debts. Death itself, patient and inevitable, waiting at the end of every trade route, at the conclusion of every contract, ready to receive what the Imperium has deemed it is owed. I speak the Emperor's name. The officer raises his weapon, and in this final moment, as the machinery of execution completes its function, I think about my father's coin, about the weight of it in my palm, about how heavy such a small thing can be when you understand what it represents, what it costs, what it takes from you in the taking. Everything can be bought or sold if you know the right price. I knew the right price. I paid it, and this is what happens when you pay it. When you trade everything sacred for survival, everything meaningful for profit, everything true for the comfortable lie that the system works, that the Imperium functions, that the Emperor watches and approves and forgives. The weapon fires. The transaction is complete. The merchant ceases to exist, erased from the ledgers of life, as efficiently as an entry corrected in a manifest, as quickly as a shipment rerouted to a different destination. Somewhere, on some other world, another merchant accepts another contract, makes another compromise, calculates another price. The system continues. The Imperium functions, and everything can be bought or sold if you know the right price, if you are willing to pay it, if you can live with the knowledge of what that payment costs. I could not live with it, so I die with it instead. And perhaps that is mercy, in its way. Perhaps that is the only mercy the Imperium offers to merchants like me, the opportunity to stop calculating, to stop compromising, to stop measuring the immeasurable. Perhaps death is the only honest transaction in a lifetime of lies, the only fair price in an economy built on exploitation, the only true value in a universe that has forgotten how to value anything except what it can extract, consume, and discard. The Emperor protects. The Imperium endures. The merchant dies, and in the dying, perhaps, finds the only peace that was ever available. The peace of an account finally settled, a ledger finally closed, a price finally paid in full.